Thanks so much, and thanks so much for inviting us. So we are doing a two-way talk, so I'm giving a little introduction, and then coming from there, my colleague will then basically show you some data which we have from some of our studies. Okay, so how does this work here? I'm always, oh, yeah, perfect. Okay, good. So what are autism spectrum disorders? What are autism spectrum disorders? Autism spectrum disorders are basically characterized by impairments in three areas, which is social interaction, communication, including language, and stereotypies and restricted interest. Now, the autism spectrum disorders have had a major shake-up, basically. What happened is that previously we had three different types of disorder, which was called autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder, and the pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. In the new nosology, what is basically happening is that these three disorders have been put together into one category, which is called autism spectrum disorder. So we don't talk about autism anymore, we talk about autism spectrum disorders. What we mean there basically is a mixture of all these three disorders, and I could go now into details how one maps to the other. However, the results we are presenting today and all the results in the literature are still on the old nomenclature. That's why I'm still bringing basically DSM-4. There are no studies right now which are on DSM-5 out there on the topic we are talking about. Okay, so what do we know about autism spectrum disorders? When autism spectrum disorders first were described, or when autism, classic autism was described, what was always shown was, let's say, is a higher male to female ratio. And the ratio basically always given is about 4:1. This is the most commonly cited statistics, and it represents basically a kind of a consensus. Some say 3:1, but it's roughly about 4:1 if you go to and that's how you pass your exam, so to speak. However, if you look at the time trends, then what you will find is that recent in-depth prevalence studies have tended to report smaller male biases. So basically what happens is that over time, in the newer studies, this ratio is going down. For example, it's just one example of studies, and I could have cited many more. In a large study in Sweden, the ratio went down to 2.3:1. So the question is basically, wait up, what is going to happen in here? Now, the big question is, why do we have this male preponderance? Now, there are a number of proposed risk and protective factors which have been discussed in the literature, and these are all biological mainly, and I'm starting with the biological factors. They are basically protective factors. So the one theory is that the female is protected, and the other one is that the male is more at risk. Now, as you know, risk and protection is the same coin. It's just what you look at it. What's for the one is a risk is for the other protection. So, females have a second X chromosome. Now, I must admit, I spent a lot of my time in my younger years to look at the X chromosome, and it wasn't the most productive time in my life. Good. So there are differences, clearly, but it's not what explains this difference in prevalence. There is an expression, as you know, of imprinted genes, and then there's females are estrogen exposed, whereas in males, as you know, they have a Y chromosome, this little chromosome, which we don't know has some genes, but not as many as the X chromosome, and they are exposed to testosterone. So basically, these are the most discussed factors. There are many others, but these are basically the most obvious factors which are discussed, what the difference could be about. What this led upon is basically to the theory of what's called the female protective effect. What this basically means is very, very simple, that autism, we know, is a very complex disorder. So it's not like Fragile X or something where you have one gene which causes the disorder. We know that these are many different factors. And with all the genes we have found, these are all increase your risk. Nothing of this is specific. There are no genes which you can say you have the gene and then you become autistic. So basically, it's always somehow an interaction between genes and environment, and it's a very complex disorder. So basically, what people assume is that there's a kind of liability for autism spectrum disorders. And then basically, once you have a combination of these risk factors and you hit a certain threshold, then basically you get the disorders. Now, this threshold is basically assumed then, or is in the model, is basically said to be different in males and different in females. Now, what you predict then is basically that in females you need more hits than in males, okay? Because females are protected, so basically. What this also predicts then is basically that if females get the disorder, then they are more strongly affected. You would also predict is that then in females, basically, since it's genetic, since they have more genetic hits than also, you would also have a higher prevalence of the disorder in first degree or second degree relatives because they have more genes basically running in these families. This has been also called the Carter effect, which was described first in pylorus stenosis and has then transferred basically to autism. And there's a huge discussion in why basically this female protective effect really plays a role in autism or not. And the results are actually a little bit different whether you look at autistic traits, whether you look basically at autism diagnosis. Now, out of this basically kind of female protective effect, there came the very popular theory, which was mainly put forward by Simon Baron Cohen, which basically says what we see in autism is just an exaggeration of naturally occurring sex differences. So basically, in the more general formulation, what he says is basically that autism is the extreme maleness of the brain. And so basically, you have your balanced brain, and you have a normal female, normal male, and then when it gets two males, then it becomes more Aspergerish. However, in more recent years, there have been other issues which have been discussed more and more, and this is really what are we diagnosing and how are we diagnosing and how are we detecting autism, and what are basically these gender biases. The diagnostic criteria are all biased towards a conventional male presentation of ASD. If you go into your diagnostic schedules, there is no difference between males and females. It's not that you judge one different from the other, so to speak. It's also well known that females adapt and compensate for aspects of autism spectrum disorders in the social area especially, that they basically compensate better. This has been called the camouflage hypothesis. It was already brought up by Lorna Wing in the 1981s, but didn't really draw enough attention, and only lately has become to the forefront. Another thing is that nowadays we are doing screening really autism very, very early. The idea is that the earlier we capture it, the better we can treat it. So there is this idea, the early intervention is basically, the earlier you do it, the better will be the outcome. Now the problem with a lot of these screening instruments basically is that they are all based again on gender biased norms. So girls basically, and this has been shown in several studies, with superficially better social skills will often only be identified later in life. So we know, and this is also known, that some girls are really diagnosed much later than males. So if you look then more on a phenotype basic, basically on a symptom basic, what you will find is that you will find usually in most of the studies show that boys have basically higher rates of repetitive behaviors, and girls usually have higher rates of emotional problems. And we will show you some data then from our studies what we found in this area. So basically what this means is, what we have found, or what this basically would say, is that repetitive behaviors are not as predictive of an autism spectrum disorders in girls compared to boys. Whereas girls are more likely to be diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder if they have higher levels of emotional and behavioral problems. So girls with an autism spectrum disorder who do not display high levels of co-occurring emotional and behavioral problems may often be at the risk of overlook. So basically where this leaves us is with this big question, do we really pick up real sex differences and as a biological factor, or do we pick up more gender differences which are more social constructs, or is it as usual somewhere away basically between both factors? And I want to hand it over now to my colleague to show us a little bit about some of the data we have. Thank you.
So Dr. Hallmayer and myself have just completed a 2-year study, which unfortunately is just completed. We don't have the iPSC results, which would be a very nice way of looking at some of the issues we're talking about today. But it was a study that was 200 children with autism spectrum disorder and 100 controls, and that was at least the initial goal. And we actually ended up with 153 with the diagnosis of autism and 134 controls. We did pretty well. But what was striking is that here we had actually a very good representation of females. So you'll see that in current studies of autism that you're actually getting this attenuation of this ratio. Now, what does this derive from? Does this derive from more acknowledgement and diagnosis in women compared to males or traditionally? We're not sure. One thing that was interesting, I have to say, and unfortunately I didn't track it empirically because it only struck me afterwards. When we were recruiting for this study, we were recruiting dominantly for these children to do blood draws. And I have to say, it was much easier to get females to do blood draws than males. In part, I think, because I was able to tell young girls, I mean, we're talking about anybody from 4 up, that it was similar to getting their ears pierced, which many of them had, and that was able to give some real context, but it was much more difficult to get males to actually, and this was tougher again in the control group. So it was actually quite an issue. But it gave us a great opportunity to say one of the limitations on looking at sex differences has been actually insufficient numbers of females participating. So we actually were able to look at all of the demographic and clinical variables that we've collected on this cohort and really see if there were any significant sex differences and if those were in line with prior literature. We actually found, in terms of just general kind of baseline characteristics, very, very few significant differences. And this was also the case for the clinical information. So just to give you a little bit of a view here, the ADIR is the Autism Diagnostic Interview, which is actually conducted by the parents. So one of the concerns in some of these recent papers pertaining to issues of diagnosis are we getting a socialized bias in how, in fact, autism is diagnosed, not least by expectations of the parents that are based along sex lines. However, the ADOS is actually the Autism Diagnostic Interview that's actually done by the investigator or the researcher or the clinician to do the diagnosis. And that's where, again, our findings here are absolutely in line with some of the more recent findings coming out in the literature. We do see a gender bias or a sex bias, but it actually is for males to have more of these domains of what are called restricted and repetitive behaviors. These kinds of preoccupations with actually set routines, doing things in an identical way, hand and motor movements that go along with that kind of repetitive motor movement. And it was more, it's only a trend finding for us, but it was the only thing that we found in this large cohort that really separated out clinically males and females. And that's just an indication of, in fact, the size of the effect there. It's very interesting because at the same time, the literature on brain imaging has brought a lot to the fore about differences in males and females with autism. There's been an awful lot of studies, but the problem there also is that those studies are actually usually relatively small sample sizes. When you think of individuals with a diagnosis of autism and what it takes to actually get them to do in your imaging scan, and you think also that you're selecting on the upper end of the performance level with people who are higher functioning, you know, there really is an inherent bias in the selection process. But in a very nice piece of work done recently by our good colleague Vinod Menon and his colleagues, they actually went in now to one of these national databases, NDAR, which had a very large sample of actually already collected morphological information on the brain and was able to examine really a fairly large sample size with over 100 women or females in that cohort and compare them with the actual brains of their male ASD counterparts. And what they found was actually very similar to ourselves. They found that the only domain area that was really different clinically was in the area of actually restricted and repetitive behaviors. And they also found that this was observed by, in fact, gray matter, cerebellar and cortical differences in motor regions, particularly those that are traditionally seen to subserve some of these kind of repetitive movements. And in that case, actually, the males had a reduced gray matter volume in those areas. And so that was quite a striking finding. But again, it's very phenotypically specific. So it kind of raises a very interesting issue. In addition to the diagnostic, perhaps, bias that might be inherent for a disorder like autism, are we also seeing that sex differences vary according to the phenotype under investigation? And is that part of the complex story that we're looking at when we're talking about sex differences in any psychiatric or other disorder? So I had been funded actually a couple of years ago to do a study of actually sleep in autism. And in part it was driven by the fact that parents have significant complaints about dysregulated sleep in their children with autism, but it was not clear if the subjective assessment really maps onto true objective sleep measures. But the other thing that's important about this is that from a neurodevelopmental perspective, particularly rapid eye movement sleep has been implicated in neuronal development and cognitive function. So we thought this would be a very interesting domain to look at. So we were funded by one of the big foundations to fund autism research, the Simons Foundation, to actually do an in-home ambulatory polysomnography assessment. So this is a full sleep assessment that captures sleep architecture, breathing, and you can see it's quite a setup. This is one of the more streamlined setups. So it's very interesting. How do you manage to get children with a disorder that actually has a tremendous amount of sensory sensitivity and other problems to engage in this? That's just the equipment we use. And we actually operationalized a form of systematic desensitization that is really just allowing the child to become familiar with the equipment and have had tremendous success. It takes a little longer for the children with autism to actually participate in the study, but our ratio of attempts to actually successful full polysomnography to give us full sleep architecture was identical. It was just absolutely the same in controls and in individuals with ASD. We found absolutely no gender differences, which was kind of interesting. It yields a tremendous amount of valuable information. This is just 30 seconds of data that allows you actually assess which brain waves you're dealing with, what stage of sleep you're in, and also what kind of breathing difficulties the individual may be experiencing at night. And so we were particularly interested in rapid eye movement sleep because rapid eye movement sleep has been implicated in memory and attentional processes. Animal studies show it is essential to actually cognitive processes in early neuronal developmental stages. It's been a little harder to track that in ASD. And if you deprive REM early in life in particular, there are significant behavioral problems, permanent sleep disruption, even neuronal cell death, which we've traditionally really assessed dominantly through animal studies. But there's been very few studies on autism. So we did one of the first, and what we found is quite interesting. We found that individuals on the spectrum definitely had shorter sleep time, took them longer to fall asleep, and they had significantly less rapid eye movement sleep. And not only that, it took them much longer to get into rapid eye movement sleep than, in fact, our what you call it age and education matched controls. So we then decided to look at this from a gender perspective. Were there any gender differences? And immediately here in this study, we've actually fewer. Our representation of women is less than in the CIRM study. But typically, what we found was, again, our repetitive behaviors actually comes to the fore. We're certainly in none of these studies, and there are different cohorts, seeing the trend towards any female preponderance for increased severity of autism, which has traditionally been thought to be the case. So we actually see the repetitive behaviors both by objective measures done by assessments in the lab as well as by parent interview, again to be more common in the males with ASD, but not in the females. But certainly nothing to suggest a more severe phenotype. It is interesting, though, if you look that actually there's an increased difference between males and females based on parental report rather than the objective reporting in the lab, which again tends to suggest there may be some diagnostic bias there. We found absolutely no differences when it came to actually performance on any of the cognitive measures. The standard theory of mind measure, which is the ability to actually examine or consider the internal representations of others and what their thoughts are, that was not different according to sex, nor was a performance on executive function, full scale IQ, nor, interestingly enough, on either verbal or performance IQ. So that was interesting. Similarly, we found absolutely no differences in any of our sleep measures within the autism group. So while overall individuals with autism actually had a very different sleep phenotype and sleep architecture to controls, there was no differences between those who were male and female actually who had autism. And that was striking and actually surprising to us until we came to the area of sleep-disordered breathing. So when we actually started to look at breathing events, which in our case, we're looking at sleep apnea, hypopnea, how many restrictive breathing events there are throughout the night, and what's the accompanying oxygen desaturation with those events. We find that males with autism actually are much more likely to have deoxygenation greater than 3 and particularly 4% compared to our females. And that's very curious because that maps onto normative data, which shows that actually men are more likely to suffer from sleep disorder breathing of all kinds. Here it's less obstructive in nature, which is what you see in your middle-age cohort, which is definitely much more males than females. But what was interesting to us was that also we found an increased number of arousals, which is probably associated with, in fact, those sleep disorder breathing events. When we then start to look at the relationship of these particular components of sleep with function, there, in fact, we found very, very few differences between males and females, with the exception, again, of our friend, the restrictive and repetitive behaviors. And it wasn't the oxygenation, or deoxygenation, that actually was associated. It was, in fact, the total number of times they wake up during the night. And in this case, we're really not seeing much impact on females, but we're seeing a very significant association between the amount of fragmented sleep an individual who's male with autism has and their performance. Then actually they'll have increased numbers of restrictive and repetitive behaviors if indeed they have a fragmented sleep. And what's interesting about that is sleep is something you can do something about, you can improve it. So it's very much a treatment opportunity. So it raises the issue, is it the oxygenation per se, or is it more just the arousals that actually we're seeing? Here there's a little less power to examine the gender effects, so it leaves that door open. But for us, it was in line with other evidence that we have that actually hypoxia is an important component that seems to have a male vulnerability in the context of autism spectrum disorders. We did a twin study of pre- and perinatal risk factors and found that actually hypoxia was associated with increased risk among males, but not among females, where it was other prenatal factors that were in fact increasing risk. So it sort of gives us a very complex landscape just looking through the lens of these two different kinds of studies. What it really suggests now is that as females are better represented in studies of autism spectrum disorders, sex differences appear to attenuate, and there's less evidence that female sex is associated with more severe symptoms. It seems that the most recent larger studies don't just find that. Sex differences in autism may reflect diagnostic bias and associated reductions in female participation that in fact there are efforts to improve upon, really changing perhaps some of the scoring, particularly for the parent reports. Also, sex differences in autism may vary according to the phenotype under consideration. We see less sex differences in the core symptoms of autism than we previously thought, but we do see significant differences in brain volume and function. So what does that reflect? And does that mean that we have clusters of symptoms and biology that actually may give us differential pathways to any given disorder? Few sex differences in sleep architect, but substantial sex differences in sleep disorder breathing that may actually confer risk along a hypoxia model. And large epidemiological studies that have recently come out suggest there are very few sex differences in the kinds of comorbidities or the prevalence of comorbidities among females with autism spectrum disorders. So sex differences, however, even when there are none, it may be that the impact actually on cognition and function is significantly different. So here we only went back and examined where we found significant differences. There's a kind of myth in the field that you have to have a main effect to see an interactive effect. It's a statistical myth. You don't. And in fact, many of us, I think, miss the opportunity to really see fundamental sex and age differences, for example, by not considering those domains where there's no obvious main effect. So the result is that there is a lot of data and literature still to be developed that fully captures the complex relationship between sex and ASD, particularly suggesting there may be very specific phenotypic profiles that are more common in males than females, but it's going to take us a while to get there. Thank you.